Welcome to everyone to this evening's class. My name is Nayaswami Jaya, and this will be the first class in a series of 10 classes on the art and science of Raja Yoga. I'm very pleased to be with you, and I welcome all of you to this class series. We're going to begin this evening with a discussion on the history and the paths of yoga. Now, when people mention the word yoga, it's often misunderstood, or perhaps it's understood in a bit of a narrow focus. What do people normally think when they hear the term yoga? They think in terms of hatha yoga, the physical postures. This is very prevalent today, and it's natural that people would think that because this is what people are generally exposed to. But yoga is something much broader and much more vast than just the yoga postures themselves. Although the yoga postures, the hatha yoga tradition, is a very important aspect and very helpful aspect to yoga. And this is what this larger context of yoga is what we'll be exploring in these 10 classes that we'll be offering, one class each week. Now, these classes that we'll be offering are supplementary to a larger course in yoga that Ananda Sangha offers. And to get the most out of this course, I would recommend, I'd like to make a couple of suggestions and recommend one, that you read the book, The Art and Science of Raja Yoga, as written by Swami Kriyananda. And in this book you'll find a number of sections. You're going to find a section on philosophy, and this is what we will be discussing in these class series. But supplementing that, you'll also find sections on hatha yoga, pranayama, health, everyday practices that you can use, a very important section on meditation. All of these are very useful, and I very much recommend that you include the reading of this book as part of this class series. The second, and perhaps the more important suggestion that I would like to make, is that you include and participate with me in this class series a practice of meditation. This class series of hatha yoga is theoretical. We're going to be discussing a number of topics and philosophy and practices and so forth, but it's not complete unless also we practice. And yoga is a science based upon meditation. You could say Raja Yoga particularly is the science of meditation. It includes all of the other yogas, the Hatha Yoga, the Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, which we'll be talking about today a little bit. But you could say that meditation is the laboratory. Yoga is more than a philosophy. It's often characterized as such by scholars as a philosophy, such as in complement with Sankhya philosophy, Vedanta philosophy. But yoga is perhaps more correctly understood, not as a philosophy, but as a science. And as any scientist will attest, in order to test your science, you need a laboratory. And our meditation practice is the laboratory for the science of yoga, for the science of meditation. And so as we go forward from week to week, I will also be occasionally giving you various exercises, meditation exercises, and suggested practices that you might do. And so during the week, if you could also incorporate a practice of meditation, 15-20 minutes a day, more if you're capable of. And this class is not a class in teaching meditation, but it complements the other classes that Ananda Sangha offers on how to meditate and the science of meditation, the science of Kriya Yoga. And so I very much recommend that you incorporate that as well and to get the most out of this class. As I mentioned, yoga is best understood as a science. And science is based upon testing. And I think this is what first attracted me to yoga, is not because of the interest in the various philosophical aspects of yoga, but I wanted something that seemed practical. I was skeptical. I first came to these teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda through reading his autobiography of a yogi. It was many years ago that I read his autobiography of a yogi, and as I read that book, I was struck by his sincerity. I was struck by the scope of what he was speaking about, but I was also a little bit skeptical because I had come from a scholarly background. I had been a university student, and it was difficult for me to accept as truth all of the things that are presented in that book. But yet, I may not have totally believed what I was reading and learning about the science of yoga, but I didn't disbelieve either. I held it in abeyance. I held judgment at arm's length, and I asked myself, how can I understand if this is true or not? And the answer to that question was presented to me by Swami Kriyananda, who was teaching that first class that I took. And he said, don't believe, test. He says, this is the mark of a science, is it's testable, it's provable. And he says, test in the laboratory of your daily experience, in the laboratory of your meditation, test to see if these truths that are being presented in this course on yoga, see if they are true by your own experience. And I think this is a hallmark of yoga, is that it's testable. It's said that these teachings of yoga have been passed down from ancient times. And naturally the question arises, how old is yoga? How is it something that has been formulated over the last few centuries in the modern presentations of yoga? Sometimes people modify the techniques and present something new, but traditional yoga is something that has been passed down from very ancient times. It's said to come from millennia ago. When I was in school, I was a major in anthropology, and we would study ancient civilizations. And I remember reading about Mohenjo-Daro and how even in those early times, many thousands of years ago, there were figurines of yogis sitting in meditative posture. So certainly it's many thousands of years ago that yoga originated. But if we understand what yoga is, maybe it's correct to ask the question and phrase it this way. Yoga is the science of soul exploration. It's the science of soul freedom. And so if we ask the question, how long has it been that mankind has been asking the question and exploring how to become free, how to achieve liberation? As long as mankind has had that question, there has been the science of yoga. Because yoga is this science. It's asking the question, how is it that this soul, this embodied soul that we find ourselves in, the soul is in this body, how is it that this soul can be totally free? And as long as that question has been asked, that is how old yoga is. But traditionally, of course, it's thousands of years old. It's actually said that yoga has been passed down from a higher age. Now, in India, this is a common understanding that ages pass through various cycles of greater and lesser awareness. But in the West, this is less understood. But when I say a higher age, people often think in terms of technology, because we live in an age where we measure the advancement of one society over another based upon the technological inventions that people have. But when we speak about these ages, these cycles of time, what we're speaking about is not so much technology. What we're speaking about is the increase and decrease in awareness, human awareness. And for various reasons which are too complicated for us to go into today, we can't explain these cycles. But suffice it to say that It is said traditionally that humankind itself goes through periods where there is increasing and decreasing cycles of awareness. And during times of greater awareness, man is able to perceive subtler realities. It's said that in these days we don't live in one of those higher ages. In fact, Swami Sri Yukteswar, the guru of Paramahansa Yogananda, said that one of the characteristics of a low age is that mankind sees the world entirely in relation to matter. In other words, we think of this reality to be entirely materialistic. Matter is the ultimate reality. Isn't that how generally mankind looks at, scientists today looks at the world? Matter is the ultimate reality. And when mankind generally, as Swami Sri Yukteswar says, in any solar system, when this is the prevalent view, it's said that that solar system is in Kali Yuga, in other words, a low age. Now, when mankind begins to question that reality and becomes dimly aware that there are subtler energies beyond matter, it's said that that is an indication that that solar system, that society is coming out of Kali Yuga and moving into the next higher age of Dwapara Yuga. And if you look about the world today, you'll see that this is what's happening. Mankind has become aware of subtler energies, electricities, as Swami Sri Yukteswar said. Man is aware that there are subtler forces at play in this world today. Swami Sri Yukteswar was writing this in the late 1800s. And in the years since then, in the century and a quarter since those days, look how much has been discovered. And it's somewhat of a confirmation that he was right. We have begun to move out of that Kali Yuga into a higher age known as Dwapara. And one of the characteristics that Swami Sri Yukteswar predicted, that in this Dwapara Yuga, man will begin to explore subtler realities that underlie matter, and that matter as the ultimate reality will no longer be the common understanding. And isn't this so? This now we speak about energy. This is a characteristic of Dwapara Yuga, is an age of energy. And this is why it's very appropriate in this age for yoga to be resurrected and to become popularized, you might say, because yoga concerns itself with these subtler forces of energy. This is one of the characteristics of the study of yoga, is the movement of life force, prana, as it's called in yoga, as it's termed in yoga. The movement of prana within the body, the movement of prana within this universe, this characterizes the study of yoga. And so this is the time for a study of Raja Yoga. Now it's important to remember when we speak of yoga being passed down from ancient times, that yoga is not a science in which its new discoveries are built upon previous discoveries, as is commonly understood in modern science. Yoga is a revealed science. It's a science that has been received from ancient times, from ancient yogis who have, through their personal experience, have understood and discovered these truths upon which yoga is based, and have passed these truths down through the ages from guru to disciple to this age. And this is the key to our understanding of yoga, is that we embody this, we are free souls already in our essence, but yet we have forgotten our freedom. It has been obscured. And so yoga is a process of not building new knowledge and discovering new realities so much as it is remembering that which we already are. It's an uncovering. It's a removing of blockages that prevent us from understanding our true nature. And so yoga is a slowly, you might say, a peeling, like a peeling of an onion, removing one layer after another layer after another layer until ultimately we get to that essence of who and what we really are. And so this is what we're going to be exploring in our study and in our courses. It's difficult to understand and have a deeper understanding of the science of yoga unless we also understand the context, the larger context, the philosophical context in which yoga resides. When we read the scriptures of yoga and we begin to study, we have to understand that it's also based on another philosophy. And traditionally in classical Indian philosophies, there are 6 primary philosophies in the classical study. 3 of them I'm just going to put aside for the moment because they don't relate to what we're speaking about. But the 3 that do apply to yoga, the first that we must understand is the philosophy of Sankhya philosophy. Sankhya philosophy underlies much of what is spoken about in yoga. Sankhya is an exploration of consciousness. It's an exploration of the relationship between consciousness and matter, and an exposition of why it is necessary for us to understand and seek freedom from matter. The soul is bound, and it longs to seek its freedom. And Sankhya philosophy explains all the reasons why this is necessary for us to be able to ultimately understand our true nature. The second philosophy that is important for us to understand a little bit about is the philosophy of Vedanta. Vedanta gives us the direction in which we need to go. You might say, what is it that we are all trying to achieve is the study of Vedanta philosophy. We are one. We are that bliss nature. We are that Satchitananda that Swami Shankara spoke about. In between these 2 philosophies of Sankhya and Vedanta resides the study of yoga. Yoga is the how. How do we achieve that freedom? If we understand that, yes, we need to be free, yes, this world is the world of Maya, there's an illusory nature to this world, the Sankhya philosophy postulates, and we want to ultimately achieve this state of bliss that's our true nature, we need to understand how to do that. And this is what the study of yoga is about. It answers that question of how. And it gives us you could say it gives us the practical application of techniques in order to be able to achieve that. And so it's a very practical science in that regard. Yoga begins with the very first aphorism. It says, now we come to the study of yoga. Swami Sri Yukteswar, when he was teaching the Yoga Sutras to Paramahansa Yogananda, spent many weeks, many discourses exploring that very first aphorism. And it seems very simple. Now we come to the study of yoga. But he said that that word now was very important. He said because it implies that there was something that had gone before. And that something, of course, is the study of Sankhya philosophy, is all the reasons why we need to seek our freedom. Why is it that we want to be free? Why is it that the soul longs for something? Why is it that this world itself isn't able to give us all of the fulfillment that we seek? And in the exploration of that, we begin to realize that yes, there's something more. And once we have that understanding, then we ask the question, okay, I understand I need to have something more, but how? How am I going to be able to achieve that? And then the Yoga Sutras proceed to the second aphorism. Yoga is the neutralization of the waves of Chitta. And this simple aphorism sums up the totality of what yoga is about. In order for us to practice yoga, in order for us to study the science of yoga, we need to understand its purpose. Why? Why are we doing these things? Why are we practicing? Why is there a need for this? And when we begin to study the various branches of yoga, you might say Bhakti Yoga, for instance, or Jnana Yoga, or Karma Yoga, we need to understand the purpose. Why are we doing these things? And it's summed up in that second aphorism of Yoga's Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Ultimately, if I was to summarize that, it's to attain a state of freedom. The neutralizing those waves of likes and dislikes. Yoga is the neutralization of the waves of Chitta. And what is that Chitta? Yogananda described it as the waves of the likes and dislikes as experienced through the ego. And so all of yoga is pointing toward this freedom from egoic self-identity through the likes and the dislikes of our biases. You might say our subjective perception of this reality. And if we understand this as the purpose of where we are going when we practice yoga, then we can apply this to the application. Even in Hatha Yoga, that physical branch of yoga, if we understand that the purpose of Hatha Yoga is not simply to stretch the body, not simply to give us better health or to make us feel a little bit more relaxed, all of which are very good, but if we understand that the purpose of yoga is to neutralize those waves of likes and dislikes, neutralize those waves of likes and dislikes that are reflected in the mental agitation of the mind, the restlessness of the mind and the restlessness of the body. It's to bring us back to that central point of our own being, that central point of stillness and calmness that resides beyond the fluctuations of the likes and the dislikes and the restlessness of the mind. This is the goal, and if we understand the goal, then we can practice those postures with that attitude or with that understanding in mind, everything coming back to that center. In the same way, if we understand that the purpose of yoga is to bring us to that central point of stillness, that central point of calm stillness, we can apply that as well to the science or to the practice of Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, or whatever our outward disposition might be. Yoga is traditionally, when we speak of the various paths of yoga, is traditionally spoken of or broken into three paths of Bhakti, Karma, and Jnana Yoga. These are sometimes referred to as the yoga of personality. And I mean that in the sense that people in this world have different personalities. We're not alike. Some people are very devotional. Some people tend to be intellectual. Some perhaps might not be either, and they just tend to be very active. And depending upon one's nature, each has their own particular techniques or approaches to the spiritual path. But it must be also understood that they are not isolated from one another. They're not separate from one another. They are complementary to one another. It wouldn't be proper if, perhaps, let's say, if a person is devotionally inclined, and it wouldn't be proper for that person to say, I'm a bhakti yogi. I don't need to use wisdom. I don't need to be wise. I don't need to serve. Obviously, that wouldn't be appropriate, nor would it be appropriate for a person of discriminative temperament to say, I'm a jnana yogi, I don't need to develop love in the heart. Well, that would obviously not be true. We need to develop all sides of our personality. In fact, Swami Sri Yukteswar, the guru of Paramahansa Yogananda, and somebody who could be characterized as a Gyan avatar, a master, an avatar of an incarnation of jnana, wisdom, he wrote in one of his treatises, The Holy Science, he said, one cannot take even one step on the spiritual path without first developing the heart's natural love. And here, this man, this great yogi, hardly would have been characterized externally as a devotional person. He was very wise and yogic in that sense. But yet in his heart, he too was devotional. He too was a bhakti yogi. And so all of us, we need to bring into balance all parts of our nature. And depending upon what our particular nature is, we can emphasize one or the other. For example, bhakti yoga is often characterized as the yoga of devotion. And so in devotion, we develop that quality of love, that love of the heart. And this, often when we speak about these three yogas, we often start with bhakti yoga for this very reason, as explained by Swami Sri Yukteswar. It's by developing the heart's natural qualities of love that we can begin the spiritual search, that we can begin the practice of yoga, because love is an expression, you could say, in its highest form of a desire. We want to know God, we want to have self-realization, we want freedom, we want liberation, and unless we have that desire for something more, we're not going to do anything. We can live next door to the world-famous restaurant, having the best food, but if we're not hungry, we're not going to go there. We're not going to order a meal. We have to have that hunger, that developing and cultivating that hunger for something more than this material reality is the essence of bhakti yoga. And we have to, the spiritual path begins with that, and it's something that has to be cultivated throughout the practice, no matter what level of development we are on. We have to have that desire for something more. It's said that one of the greatest impediments in the practice of yoga and the practice of meditation or any spiritual endeavor is to fall into the trap of spiritual indifference. And maintaining oneself or protecting oneself from indifference and cultivating that desire is the goal, is, you might say, or the practice, not the goal. It's the practice of bhakti yoga. Bhakti yoga develops love of the heart. And love of the heart is one of the aspects of the divine. The divine is said to have experienced as an experiential reality, something that we can, for ourselves, experience. It manifests in 8 different ways, primary ways, and love is one of those. Wisdom is another, sound, light, power, bliss, what are the other 2? Joy is another, and calmness, peace. Those are the primary ways that God, you could say, the divine, that ultimate state toward which we're all seeking, what we are all seeking, and toward what all that we're working, manifests within us. And love is one of those primary ways, and it's where we begin, you could say, somewhere in the beginning of the spiritual path to cultivate in order to make further progress. But we must understand that bhakti yoga also has as its goal this freedom. And ultimately it has as its goal a calm stillness. Many people associate bhakti yoga with outward ritual, perhaps outward chanting, outward practices of devotion, worship, singing, dancing, even in ecstasy. These are wonderful states. But when we come to a deeper state of Bhakti Yoga, we approach that point of neutralization when the waves, any outward wave of disturbance, slowly calms till we come to that still central point when anything outward becomes a disturbance to that calm central stillness within. There's a very famous saint in the Catholic tradition her name was Teresa of Avila, and she mentioned in her autobiography or in her story of her life, she mentioned how she began her spiritual practices with outward devotion, outward prayer, outward repetition of prayer in a rosary. But she finally, in her prayers, came to a state where she was no longer able to pray outwardly. And she entered into an inward state where prayer, outward prayer of any sort, was a distraction. And at that point, her advisors, the spiritual advisors, the priests to whom she would go for confession, had advised her and told her that no, you must repeat these prayers, you must repeat this outward form of worship, and admonished her. But she found that within she couldn't. She simply couldn't. She would go beyond the state of outward prayer. And it was only after a long, difficult period of her life that she realized that the priests themselves, she had to ignore the outward advice of the priests and follow her own inward devotions. Christ ultimately appeared to her inwardly and guided her in her devotions. And this is the state that we all achieve and we seek to achieve when we practice Bhakti Yoga. We chant, we pray, we do these outward forms, but ultimately they all lead to this inner stillness. This practice of Bhakti Yoga is, I think, some of the most beautiful of the saints of the Indian tradition were practitioners of this. We go back to the Bhakti period of a few hundred years ago, Saint Chaitanya and Haridas. I remember there was a story, I believe it was Saint Haridas, but it could have been another. He was wandering about chanting God's name, Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, and he was accosted by some ruffians in the village that he was passing through, and they tied him up and they began to beat him. And as they were beating him, he was chanting Hare Krishna, Hare Rama. And as each blow was delivered to him, he would continue to chant even louder. And he felt that it was God himself, that God was there with him. And the louder he chanted, the more finally those who were beating him began to feel his joy. And with each blow, his joy, Haridas's joy, would increase, and with each blow, as he would chant God's name, the ruffians who were beating him would begin to feel God's joy too, until finally they put down their sticks and the cudgels that they were using to beat him with, and they too began to dance in ecstasy. They could feel this joy coming out of Haridas at that time. And this is the beautiful expression of God's love in this beautiful tradition. And it's something that all of us should practice if we can in our devotions, in our practice of yoga. Paramahansa Yogananda made a very interesting statement. He said, chanting is half the battle. We awaken the energy within us through our chanting. We awaken God's attention, you might say. We uplift our energy. Feel how joyful. When we feel joy, what do we feel? We feel an upward movement. This upward movement of energy in the body is always associated with the divine state. God is always spoken of in terms of an upward movement of energy, and chanting is a wonderful way in order for us to achieve that. Now, but as you chant, bring your chants outwardly with vigor at first, but then slowly, little by little, go inward until finally you're chanting inwardly with the heart's devotion. It's merely a heart's calling to the divine. And ultimately, as you practice this deeper and deeper, you enter into a state of inward absorption, of inward silence, as you merge your consciousness into that divine state of ecstasy within. This is the goal that we need to keep in mind when we practice Bhakti Yoga. Now, the second classical yoga of personality is that of Jnana Yoga. Jnana Yoga is the yoga of wisdom. And the tool that is used typically as associated with Jnana Yoga is that of discrimination. We have to discriminate. Not this, not this. Neti, neti, classically is said. Neti, neti, not this, not that. Or, as Ramana Maharshi would say, the exploration of this question of who am I? Now, when I first heard this, I tried to think, what does that mean? What is not this, not that, who am I? Discrimination. And I began to explore the question of what does it mean to discriminate in life. Now, we know that word sometimes is used in a negative sense. People discriminate against this person or discriminate against that person prejudicially. But the power of discrimination is an extremely important one on the spiritual path, and it must be used by the Bhakti Yogi, by the Karma Yogi, by whatever yoga one is inclined to practice. To discriminate, if I could put it in very simple words, is the ability to discern right from wrong. Now that raises a second question: what is right and what is wrong? And the religionist might say, well, it's right, this is this moral code versus this is good and this is evil. And we think of it in good and bad in those terms, but right and wrong has a deeper meaning as well, or perhaps a more refined way to look at it. That which is right, you might think of it this way, is that which leads a person toward greater soul freedom. That which is wrong is that which leads you to greater bondage. Bondage particularly in the ego. What is going to take you into the ego? What is going to take you away from egotistic concerns? What is going to take you towards soul freedom? Now, this is not something that you can write in a manual, a code of conduct. Each person has their own has to decide and discern for themselves at each particular situation what is going to lead them to freedom. Now, some people object to this as it seems to be somewhat value relative or moral relative, but it's not so. We are as human beings made in a certain way. There are certain universal principles that will lead to greater freedom. There are certain principles that will lead to greater bondage. A person who is unkind, for instance, and we'll go more into this when we have a discussion of Yama and Niyama in a couple of weeks from now. But let's take, for instance, a person who is unkind, a person who is harmful to others, or perhaps unkind in words and deeds. Often words are more destructive than deeds. It can be very cutting. But if a person is unkind, this leads to bondage, because what are we affirming in unkindness? We're affirming that another person is different from us, that that person is separate, that person in being separate reinforces my own feeling of separateness from that person, and that reinforces my sense of ego, individual ego, as opposed to the unity which is at the essence of yoga. Yoga can be defined as union. It's union of the little self with the higher transcendental self. It's union of the soul with God, however it might be defined. But it's also, yoga is transcendence of the ego into a higher state of understanding, into self-realization of who and what we really are. And so anything that leads to greater concentration of ourselves within the ego greater concentration of our attention in the ego is going to be binding and is against the direction in which our soul naturally longs to move, and that's towards freedom, of what we ultimately each of us wants, which is soul freedom, is the definition of the practice of yoga. So consequently, discrimination is that ability to discern. Is this going to take me to freedom? Is this going to take me into greater bondage? And universally, there are certain practices, there are certain ways of behaving that tend to be more freedom-inducing. Again, this will be covered in greater length later, but again, I'll use another example. Something you might use in your own life in the practice of discrimination. What leads to greater expansion? Expansion of consciousness, a sense of largeness, of a largeness for yourself. If something is expansive, there's a likelihood that it might be worthwhile. If it tends to be contractive, this is an indication that perhaps it's contractive into the ego, so be careful. Another guideline might be, does something lead to a sense of joy? Inner joy, not pleasure. We're speaking about a joy is an expansive feeling of the heart. Does your action lead to a sense of expansion? Or does your action lead to a sense of contraction? And where there's contraction, you're going to find less joy. Where there is expansion, you're going to find joyfulness. Joy and expansion go together. A third area that you may use to discriminate, is this good? Is this bad? Is this healthy for me spiritually? Less healthy for me? Does it expand your sympathies? Does it make you feel sympathetic to the situation of those around you? Does it help you to relate to the realities of others? Or is it thinking merely of yourself? Does it have a selfish quality to it? This again, you can begin to see. You can discriminate. One leads to greater freedom, the other leads to bondage. And this ability to discriminate is essential no matter what our outward disposition or what our outward nature might be. We all need to be able to do this. The Bhakti yogi needs to understand that as well. Is my enthusiasm leading to freedom, or is my enthusiasm for God, for the divine, leading to bondage? Is it emotional, which tends to be egoic, will lead to restlessness, or is it expansive? Is it taking me beyond the emotions to a more universal experience of the divine? The Karma Yogi needs to have the power to discriminate. Karma Yoga, as we'll come to understand, is the yoga of right action. Well, in that very word, right action, we need to use the power of discrimination. What is right action? What action is going to lead me to freedom, and what attitude with that action will lead to greater freedom or to bondage? And so this quality of, or this power, this tool of discrimination is critical and is the characteristic trait of the Jnana Yogi. The Jnana Yogi tends to look within, analyze, not over-scrutinize, but is cognizant of the direction of his soul progress, and is able to parse: is this leading one direction, or is it leading the other? Now, the third of these yogas of personality is that of Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is the yoga of action, of right action. But what is right action? I have often heard people who have perhaps had difficulty meditating, perhaps have had difficulty, not particularly devotionally inclined nor discriminative, say, well, at least I'm a karma yogi, which means that then in their case, what they were doing is justifying their restlessness, their inability to sit still. And yes, karma yoga is associated with action, but it's not what a person does. A person might say, I'm doing a good work, I'm building a hospital, I'm working in a school, I'm doing a charitable action, therefore I'm a karma yogi. Well, certainly those are good things to do and will bring a person good karma back to themselves to do proper, helpful things to other people outwardly. But does that make one a karma yogi? Not necessarily. Karma yoga is not so much what we do, but how we do it. It's the attitude with which we approach our actions in life. It's an attitude of how we live our life. And the essence of karma yoga is summed up by the saying of action without desire for the fruits of action. Acting in the right way, not so much outwardly what the right thing to do is outwardly, but yes, that's important. But with what attitude are we acting? We want to be able, you might say, to act in a way that embodies the true spirit of service. Karma yoga the goal of karma yoga is to act in such a way that we do not incur karma. Karma is any action that is done from the principle of ego. From the ego principle is motivating that action. I am acting. And typically, that idea of I am acting takes place when we have the concomitant thought of I, by acting, will receive such and such a result. Even in meditation, we shouldn't meditate with the thought, I'm meditating in order to receive something in return. It's very hard not to do that. Certainly we all want joy, we want bliss, we want devotion, we want God to come to us. It's hard to be able to transcend that. But the pure expression of karma yoga is not the thought that I am the actor, but that God is acting through me. That I am an instrument of this action, that I am acting on behalf of something larger. And if we can act in this spirit, Nishkam Karma, this idea of acting in such a way that we are not attached to the results of that action. We act because it is the right thing to do. We act because it is the appropriate thing to do. It's the honorable thing to do, if you want to say it that way. It's that action that is appropriate for the situation, but not necessarily for the immediate results of that. Now, that attitude is quite difficult because often people, when they're trying to become karma yogis and to act without a desire for the fruits of action, one of the pitfalls is a person will associate that sort of action with indifference. Well, if there's no result in this for me, why should I act with enthusiasm? And so consequently, karma yogis sometimes approach their life with a bit of indifference. They don't care what the results might be. If it succeeds, fine. If it fails, fine. And you can see where that's going to lead. There's an indifference. Now remember earlier when I mentioned that one of the pitfalls of the spiritual path is spiritual indifference. Well, in the same way, we have to avoid any sort of outward indifference. We have to act with enthusiasm because this is God's world that we are serving. It is God that we are serving. It is the divine that we are serving. And so consequently, any servant who is serving his master and doesn't care that the master is pleased, well, naturally, he's not a very good servant. So in that sense, we're serving, and yes, we want to serve in that spirit as best as we can, but the pleasure that comes back to us is not toward the ego. It's wanting to please God because God is beauty, God is all bliss, and in the serving, we find that that beauty and that bliss flows through us. And so we want to please and we want to serve, but yet we ourselves are not, the ego itself is not exalted in that process. Now, admittedly, that's a very fine line. Swami Kriyananda was, in many ways in his life, was a very good karma yogi, a perfect karma yogi. He gave a bit of advice in this regard. He says the karma yogi, or any yogi in action, often runs into this dilemma. In the monastic tradition, in order to overcome the sense of egotism, monks and nuns are often encouraged to suppress the ego, to diminish the ego, to do all they can to make the ego small. And although he agreed with that principle, he said in practice, it's sometimes very difficult to approach the spiritual path that way. He said, think instead of expanding your sense of self to infinity. Expand your sense of self to embrace all. Not now, admittedly, this is tricky, but he said, think in terms of serving, when you're serving other people, think in terms of expanding yourself to ultimately serving everything, serving God in all that you do. Try to expand your sympathies to embrace everything rather than to minimize and not thinking of anybody. Try to see God in other people, that when you're serving other people, try to feel that that not just those that are close to you or your friends and your family or those that you love. Try to expand your love to include other people, your neighbor. Try to include others in your community, of your nation, until ultimately you expand your love to everybody. He said, Paramahansa Yogananda said, this is the social approach to God, a sense of expanding the sense of self to include all. And we can put this into practice. Swami Kriyananda was a master of doing this. He liked to shop at local stores rather than in the big supermarkets because it allowed him to meet individual shopkeepers and have a personal relationship with those with whom he was doing a commercial transaction. And whenever he would go into a shop, he would try to make friends with that shopkeeper, and he would try to embrace that person spiritually. He would try to embrace that person as a member of his spiritual family, and in one way or another do little kindnesses to them. And next time that you go shopping, try this. When you approach the shopkeeper, approach him as your friend. Think of him as your friend, and spiritually include him in your aura, as if he was somebody or she was somebody that you've known all your life, and try to bless that person in your aura. And then if you learn to do that with one individual, another individual, then you can begin to expand that thought to include others. And in this way, you expand your sense of self beyond the confines of your little ego. This is a good practice in Karma Yoga. This is acting as an instrument for the divine until you begin to feel that God is flowing through you in all of your actions. And slowly, through this practice, you become less attached because it's all God's work. It's God's world. This world is God. The results of what you do is God. It all belongs to God. This is the right practice of Karma Yoga. Action without the desired fruits of action, but acting in the sense that God is the doer, not I, me, is the doer. And finally, these three yogas we can add to them a fourth, and that's the practice and the science of Raja Yoga. Raja, the kingly yoga. And as the king sits on the throne over his domain, so it is that Raja Yoga includes all other yogas within it. You can say these three yogas are the approach, the technical The techniques that are practiced in the practice of Raja Yoga are are according to the temperament of whether a person is devotional or a little bit more intellectual, or a person is more of an active nature. But all of them come under the heading of Raja Yoga. In addition, we have the specific practices that also are subsets of the practice of Raja Yoga. Hatha Yoga, for example, is not a yoga in and of itself. It's the physical discipline or the physical science that is a part of Raja Yoga. In the same way, we have Mantra Yoga, we have Kundalini Yoga, we have the yoga of breath, pranayama, all of these specific practices which can be made into a deep science of their own, a concentration of techniques which make it seem that it's distinct, are but elements of this larger science of Raja Yoga. And this is the practice or the science that we're going to be speaking about in these lessons that we're sharing. The practice, the central practice of Raja Yoga, which applies and is applied to all of the subsets of yoga that come under it, is the science of meditation. Raja Yoga is the science of meditation. And the highest expression of that science of meditation is the science of Kriya Yoga. This is the science that was brought, the techniques of Kriya were brought to the West in the early part of the 20th century by Paramahansa Yogananda. And this is the science that underlies this approach to Raja Yoga, which we'll be speaking about in the weeks ahead. This science of Raja is something, and the science of meditation is the laboratory, as I began our discussion an hour ago. This is the laboratory by which we will be able to test the philosophy and the teachings that we'll be sharing in the weeks ahead. And it's something I encourage each of you to incorporate into your daily practice.